We just heard the theme to The Partridge Family, the TV series that launched David Cassidy into music stardom and made him the most famous TV teen idol of all time. But David was quick to point out in interview after interview that he was not the character of Keith Partridge in real life. Naturally, that begs the question, well, just who was David Cassidy? Our guest today can answer that question better than most people. Chip Deffaa is an author, playwright, jazz historian, songwriter, director, and producer, and, like David Cassidy, he's from New Jersey. He was also David's collaborator and ghostwriter on his memoir, Come On, Get Happy, Fear and Loathing on the Partridge Family Bus. Chip Deffaa, welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm happy to be here, Ghosty.
You know, I've often mentioned on the show that David Cassidy was the first pop star, rock star really, that I was ever even aware of as a child, and it's through my fandom of the Partridge Family and David Cassidy that I got heavily into music and collecting records, and it led me down a path that included the Beatles and the Beach Boys and into new wave music and heavy metal and punk rock. The whole thing, it all starts with David Cassidy. I'm just curious, were you a fan of David Cassidy? Did you have any of his records before you got together with him to write the book?
Yes, I was a fan right from the start, and we happened by just sheer coincidence or chance to have some mutual friends and stuff like that. And when he asked me if I wanted to write the book, I was so busy, I didn't know how I could say yes, but I was sort of flattered and intrigued, and we made it happen.
So how did that come about? You know, you have mutual friends, but he was aware that you were a writer?
Oh, yes. I wrote for many years for the New York Post, and I wrote for Entertainment Weekly. So he said he liked my writing and that it was, like I wrote like a person, like conversational. He wanted more of that average guy's kind of voice rather than an academic voice or a New York Times formality or something like that. And when he came to me with the idea, first I said I can't. I was in the middle of a book had been dying to do for years on called Blue Rhythms, on rhythm and blues singers Ruth Brown and Laverne Baker and Charles Brown and all these people I loved. And I was like halfway through it, and I said, I don't have a minute to spare. And I said, David, could we set a deadline like 2 years from now to get it done? And David says, oh, I want it done in 2 months. And I said, 2 months? How could I possibly do a book in 2 months? I said, I don't think I could ever do a book in less than 3 months. And he says, if you can do it in 3 months, we'll start today. And we started, and it was crazy. And I told him, don't get your hopes up. You know, the parade sort of passed you by. You know, this isn't going to sell. And all through the thing, I kept wanting to tell him I'm doing this as a labor of love, but I don't think there's a world waiting for a book on David Cassidy. And when I finished the manuscript, and he looks at it and he says, this is going to be a bestseller. It's going to get me on Oprah and all the shows, and we'll do some publicity together, and then they'll make a TV movie out of it. And I thought by then he was delusional. I said, David, come on now. You know, you've still got a few fans from the old days, but I'm one of the few left. And to my surprise, total surprise, everything happened like he said. It became a bestseller. He was on Oprah and all the different shows, and they made a TV movie out of it.
So when you're getting together with David, and boy, that's a very compressed span of time in order to do all that, what were you sitting and speaking with him and recording him for hours at a time?
Yeah, we had to catch it when we can. He was doing a show on Broadway. He and his brother Sean were doing Blood Brothers on Broadway. And I would go to the dressing room and try to talk to him before a performance or after a performance, or whenever we could find a way to make some time. And, you know, he talked so much. He was a Jersey boy like I was. We were the same age. We both grew up in northern New Jersey. When he was a kid, he lived in West Orange. I grew up in Bergen County, which was close. And he had talked to me about the little places he loved in West Orange, and I said, let's go out and drive there. We'll get in my big old Lincoln, and we'll drive around West Orange, and we'll see these places. And he was so happy. One of the few times I ever saw him really happy of seeing places that he hadn't seen since he was like 9 years old and stuff. And he was very adamant that he was happier as a kid before he was famous than he ever was during the Partridge Family and the concerts and stuff. Most of the time when we talked, when he let his mask down, when he wasn't being a public performer or doing a signing autographs, or doing an interview for the press or the public, radio or TV or something like that, he was very unhappy. I mean, when he would do a talk, like we set up this thing where he did a talk to the kids at the high school in West Orange where he grew up. It was an idea of some of the girls in the schools had this idea. And he gave a wonderful talk, and he was like sparkling on stage. But once he was off stage, before it and afterwards, when we were just alone privately, he was the same guy who was saying to me, I think I've lost my capacity to experience pleasure. I mean, he was the saddest guy I'd ever met in my life, much of the time. And that made it very hard to do the book because he would tell me one sad story after another, and then he'd look it over and he'd say, can you punch this up? Can you make it sound funnier and lighter and like it doesn't bother me so much? And I said, David, it sort of is what it is, because so many of the stories were somebody letting him down or abandoning him, his dad not keeping a promise, or his agent becoming a drug addict and dying, or losing lots of money, or going broke and going from having $8 million to having, negative $500,000, and this belief he had that he was liable to screw it up again. He would just say to me, I'm just a screw up, I always have been, so even if I make money now, it doesn't matter, I'm going to blow it all, I'll lose it all. But if he had to go outside our little private conversation, if there were fans waiting for him, he knew how to smile and like any good actor could, and be what they wanted to see, this happy-go-lucky guy. And he had me write out a little piece for him. I mean, he used my words so that when he did interviews to say how happy he was with his life and how he'd grown and learned, but it was like a set speech. It was like a monologue that worked for an actor. So whether he was doing Oprah or he was doing a radio show in Indianapolis, he would say the same little thing. They'd say, how's your life going? And he'd say, well, I've learned this and that, and I've grown so much, and my life is very happy now, and I wake up with a smile. And it was like a rehearsed thing. But then if we met privately, it would be, nothing really was going well. He was not getting satisfaction out of the work, out of marriage, out of his career, out of his, a lot of things were challenges for him.
Do you think this unhappiness had its roots in David's difficult relationship with his father, the actor and singer Jack Cassidy? I know that rather than be supportive of David's career, Jack Cassidy was jealous and was always putting him down.
Yes, when I said to him, David, what's your primary motivation in writing the book? Why do you want to write the book? And he said, I want the world to know what a bad father I had. I want the world to know what a bum Jack Cassidy was. And we would alternate. I mean, one day, in one breath, he would be telling me how terrible his father was and how many times his father would say, yes, I'll be there for your Little League game, I promise, and the father wouldn't show up. Or I'll be there for your graduation from whatever it was, grade school, and he wouldn't show up. It was a litany of broken promises. And yet at the next breath, he'd say to me, Hal Prince wanted me to star in a Broadway revival of She Loves Me. And I said, oh, that'd be a wonderful opportunity for you. He says, I could never do that role as good as my father did it. My father was the greatest performer I ever saw in my life live. The single greatest performer I ever saw, and he had seen Elvis and the Beatles and everybody. And he said, no, he says, I could never compete with the memory of Jack Cassidy. And it was odd to me how much he would tell me on the one breath that he had the worst father in the world and how many months he could go without speaking to his father because his father, he says, my father was crazy and he was jealous of me and he put me down and always made me feel inferior. And then at the next breath, he'd be telling me, we should go grab a meal, and the only place to eat in New York is Frankie and Johnny's Steakhouse. And I'd say, why Frankie and Johnny's Steakhouse? He says, because my father told me it's the best place. He always ate there. And if his father had said it once when he was 8, it was like God had spoken the word. So he was still like the best place to get a suit was the place his father recommended. The best steakhouse was that. The best agent, he always, he had the same agent his father had and his stepmother Shirley Jones had, and it was unthinkable that he might have a different agent than his father had. And the last recordings he made were, he was working on an album, Songs My Father Taught Me, and they were songs then, but all throughout his life he loved the songs that his father loved. He loved the theater songs besides the rock stuff. I mean, and he would pull out into concerts show tunes and things. He would sing Valley High, which fans weren't expecting, or If I Didn't Care, which was an old hit from the Ink Spots. He made that a hit in England. and he did a beautiful recording of it, but it wasn't what the record companies wanted him to record. It was something that spoke to him because it was the kind of music his father loved. So he was very complicated, but his father would be very belittling, and David had enough insecurity to be really hurt by it badly. So the father would tell him, "Oh, you're just a manufactured star. You know, they could have put anybody in that suit and put him on a TV show, and he'd be popular. And you didn't work your way up like I did. I worked my way up from smaller shows and smaller roles and chorus boy to leading role on Broadway and doing 8 shows a week. That's the real medal of a performer if you can, star in a Broadway show 8 days a week." And so some of what he was trying to do later of showing that he could do Blood Brothers on Broadway and then on tour and performing grueling shows in Las Vegas, and he was performing both on Broadway and Las Vegas with injuries that he really should have taken time off. And he'd be, even when we were talking when he was doing Blood Brothers, he was like in a lot of pain. He had I forget what it was, he had hurt something, and yet he knew how to just mind over matter. He wasn't going to miss a performance. He wasn't going to let the pain show. He was going to smile. And in Las Vegas, he had seriously hurt his foot, and he was on prescription painkillers to cope, and that didn't help because he had an addictive personality already, as he knew, and he had been warned by professionals that he couldn't treat drinking or drugs casually, that the risks were very high for him. It was in his family. His father had problems with addiction, and yet he couldn't shake that either, which, of course, eventually kills him.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll have more with Chip Deffaa right after this. From 1976, a song written by David Cassidy and Jerry Beckley of America, that's Getting It in the Street. And I chose that because there are some autobiographical lyrics there about David growing up with his mother and father. Our guest today is Chip Deffaa, who ghostwrote David Cassidy's memoir, Come On, Get Happy, Fear and Loathing on the Partridge Family Bus. And we were talking about David's troubled relationship with his father, Jack Cassidy, and you spent a lot more time with him than I did. I only had 15 minutes with David Cassidy when I interviewed him, but it did strike me the same way I guess it struck you, that here he was, and we knew his history with Jack Cassidy, here he was during the interview speaking so lovingly about his father.
Yes, in one breath he could fault Jack, and then he could say, but nobody was more charming than him, and everybody in the family says, I have more of Jack Cassidy in me than anybody in the family, than any of my brothers. I've got his personality, I've got his smile, I've got his charm, I've got his devils. And he would say, Jack Cassidy went around trying to seduce the whole world. And he would tell me about Jack hitting on the same girls David was hitting on, and once they wound up sleeping with the same girl. But at the same time, he didn't ultimately hold that against he sort of like half admired his father for the things he could get away with and stuff. It was strange. I'd say what a good singer David was, and I'd say, David, your singing is underrated. It's not appreciated because it came out of a TV show. Some people never actually seriously listened. You can listen to the recordings, or if you saw him live, he was actually a very good singer. And I'd tell him, you're a good singer. He'd say, but not like my dad. He'd say, my dad was this, my dad was that. And then the next breath he'd be saying to me, but my dad never gave me any time. My dad hurt me growing up. He was not honest with me, And then he'd turn around and he might say to me, Chip, you have such a cool car. I had this big old Lincoln. I still have this big old Lincoln from like the 1990s. He says, this car is a classic. He says, my dad would have loved it. This car is so jacked. And that was like a compliment. My dad would have loved it. And I'm like, so even though his dad had been long dead, the dad came up in conversation all the time. But he was seriously hurt as a child. His father never even told him. He was trying to spare David, I guess, but David did not know when his parents got divorced. They didn't tell him that. All he knew was suddenly his dad was no longer with him and his mom, and he thought it was his dad was rejecting him, and he didn't know his dad was making a new life. And one of the neighborhood kids had to tell him, your parents are divorced, which was like a big social taboo, for good little kids in the 1950s. And when he had to ask his father if he was divorced, he was scared what the answer would be, and the father told him yes, but he didn't know that till then. So he had lots of well-founded trust issues, of are people honest with me? Can I rely on them? But he would put himself down. It was painful. He also told me, if I told him, I like you, he'd say, wait till you know me better. In the end, you're not going to like me. Everybody turns against me in the end. He says, you won't be my friend in the end. I mean, it was a very odd thing to say to somebody. If you knew me better, you wouldn't like me. I mean, I've never had anybody else say anything remotely like that, and he believed it. And his mother, not Shirley Jones, she was his stepmother.
Right.
His mother would say nice things about him to me, and he'd say, well, that's just a mother. And then when I called Shirley Jones and she says nice things about him, he says, what else is she going to say? She's just nice all the time. You shouldn't be talking to her. I mean, she thinks I'm some nice guy. And his mother would say to me, I don't know why David puts himself down, and he makes his life sound worse than it is, and he makes it sound like David would tell me, I never got a good grade in school in my life, and his mother says, that's not true. David, you did good in this, and you did good in that, and it wasn't all good, but it wasn't all bad either. But David wanted me to believe somehow that he was just totally screwed up on everything. And it was interesting because a lot of times you meet people, especially celebrities, and it's the opposite. They want to make you believe that they were more successful than they were, or whatever. And David was trying to convince me, it was sort of like if I said, oh, you did a great show. He said, well, you caught me on a good night. But he actually was. I watched him in Blood Brothers, and he was a good Broadway performer, and that's why there were Broadway producers asking him to do more theater, and he had scored successes in London on the stage, too. And he says, oh, people are just coming out because they remember I was popular from the Partridge Family. And it was more than that, because I saw other people who were popular on TV, Barry Williams, from the Brady Bunch. He tried to do stage performances, and he couldn't command a stage. He didn't have that kind of stage presence. He was fine on the Brady Bunch, but he really couldn't make much of a stage career. And I saw David and that audience, they weren't all Partridge Family fans. There were people who were coming because it was a hit musical and came away impressed, but I couldn't have convinced him of that. And he said, my first marriage ended in divorce, my second marriage ended in divorce. He wasn't, when he was in Las Vegas, he made no secret he was living his life, really apart from his wife and son, and it's odd. We wrote the book, and the book is filled with accounts of his, that he had sexual encounters with lots of fans and stuff like that.
Right.
Lots of sex in it. And then when we finished the last page of the manuscript, and he rereads it again, and we've submitted to Warner Books, and the editor's already started editing on it, and he says to me, someday, what if my son reads this book? It says I had all these sexual experiences, and what's my wife going to say reading all these sexual experiences? He says, Chip, take all the sex out of the book. I said, David, it's too late. We've submitted to Karen Kelly, the editor. If you want to talk to her. He says, we got to take the sex out. What if my son reads this? And I said, David, when the time comes to tell your son not to read it, which is what he did wind up doing, and the son still never read the book. But he says, Chip, let's do this. Leave all the sex in, but can we add one line that said, I never enjoyed any of the sex. Any of it. I said, David, I said, that's not going to really save you with your wife or your son, and it's not going to be believed. But if you want to pitch that idea to the editor, talk to her directly, because I can't, that was just too silly. He was a big success in Las Vegas. He was a huge draw for years. And he could go out to the concerts with his fans, and even if he felt like hell, he could give them so much happiness, and he was always capable of that. And he could joke about it a little bit in some perverse way. If I say, David, you weren't just made by TV. TV can't just make everybody a star, because there's a lot of TV stars who tried to cut records that didn't necessarily become, the public didn't go for them, I said, David, you had something. You have a little charisma on that stage that's in you, and that's not because someone gave you a TV show to be in. And he would joke. He'd say, yeah, there's probably some truth in that. He says, I have the kind of face and personality that if my guidance counselors were wise, when I was 16 and I asked, what should I do with my life, they would have said, the only job for you is to be a teen idol. And it was sort of a joke, but it was sort of true. He says, like, I was sort of destined to that. And he was right. You know, he had the hair, the puka shell beads. And I put his character into a play of mine, just a little joke as a joke. I write plays and I write songs and produce albums. I do a lot of different things. And all he cared about was so long as the guy playing him was good looking. He didn't care what the character said or did, you know. And I said, it'll be good looking.
You know, based on everything you're describing here, it sounds like David needed therapy.
He had years of it. David had endless therapy. And David told me he thought, and I don't know if this is scientific truth or if someone gave him this thought or if it's just nonsense, but he thought he had done so much excess drinking and drugging that it had altered his brain chemistry so that the pleasure receptors may have been damaged. He said, I'm not the person I was. I cannot experience pleasure the way I did when I was younger. He says he thought it was some physical change, not just a matter of like having a bad day, or we all have bad moods sometimes. He thought, and maybe I don't know where he picked that up, if some psychologist suggested that or if he just thought it on his own, but he felt all the therapy he had never really changed anything, and that something in him had changed. He went through the Partridge Family and all the fame and all the adulation, and then therapy couldn't really give him back the happiness he knew before he was famous, which was an interesting outlook. Eventually, of course, the alcohol and stuff caught up with him in the end. It was definitely alcoholism at the end of his life. But I'm saying even when he was functioning well, he claimed he wasn't getting joy out of it. He said nothing, even like he'd have a drink and like some white wine or something, and I'd say, but David, you told me the doctors don't want you to drink at all. He says, oh, but I need it to relax me. And I said, well, does it give you any pleasure? And he says, no, it gives me no pleasure. And I couldn't understand the logic of it. Then why, if somebody's telling you this is harmful to you and you're not getting pleasure out of it, but it was just what it was. And yet he tried to warn the kids when he went to West Orange High School that fame isn't all it's cracked up to be, and that he tried to put in some honesty into it, and they just wouldn't hear it. All they saw was like, somebody from our town became successful. We all want to be like you. And we're driving back, and he's like, they all have stars in their eyes. None of them heard what I was trying to tell them. They all think it's got to be so great to have the fame and make the money. But even at the height of his fame, when he played like Madison Square Garden and he'd play these huge venues, he had as many bad memories of those big nights as good memories. Playing Madison Square Garden and then being whisked away by security and hidden in the trunk of a car and driven out to some sleazy motel in Queens so the fans couldn't find him, or this concert in England where they had 60,000 people in the stadium. And a girl gets crushed to death because the fans are out of control and they're just surging forward to see him, and there was really not enough security. So he would remember these things that should have been like good memories, but they all were tinged with something bad. And he showed me this wonderful scrapbook full of clippings, from one clipping after another, about 60,000 people seeing him here and so many thousands of people seeing him here, one success after another. And I'm like, oh, David, but these are good, all these highlights. And he says, you want the scrapbook, keep it. And he gave it to me. He says, I don't want to remember those days.
We're talking with Chip Deffaa, the co-author of David Cassidy's autobiography of 1994, Come On, Get Happy, Fear and Loathing on the Partridge Family Bus. And we've been having a pretty fascinating conversation this hour. I wanted to address music for a bit because I'm a big fan of the Partridge Family music and David Cassidy's solo music. And he's always said in interview after interview, he said as much to me when I interviewed him, that he always preferred a heavier rock sound and he was always going in that direction. And I always felt like he was saying that to try and impress this imaginary Rolling Stone magazine crowd who looked down on him. And I wish that someone could have, shown him the future and shown that Rolling Stone classic rock mentality has faded away, and we sort of look back on that and laugh at how naive it was. And the good music, the music that moves people, includes some of the records that he recorded.
He had nothing to be ashamed of because those were wonderful pop recordings for what they were. I Think I Love You is a terrific song. I mean, it became a hit before the TV show started. It was finding an audience, and it was finding an audience because it was good pop for what it was. And he might have said, oh, that's not the music I would have made if I had my own choice. But even that, I used to argue with him because when he would make his own choices, he wasn't trying to be Mick Jagger. He wasn't trying to be, like he would say to me, sometimes the record companies, they would fight me and they wouldn't let me record what I wanted. And he'd tell me, like, songs he wanted to record that they didn't want to record. And they weren't some kind of hard rock thing. They were more like, like it was a Harry Nilsson song he wanted to record. That was still closer to the image, And so I'd say, and plus, in his private time, like if he wanted to put on something for, like to listen to in private, in his dressing room or something like that, it was just as likely to be Gershwin as it was to be, maybe more so than Jimi Hendrix. So it was nice to say, I could understand him wanting to say that or wanting to tell Rolling Stone, I want to be taken seriously and I really like this hard rock stuff. There were times when he had extra money and he could have recorded on his own anything he wanted, and he really wasn't trying to go out and out-rock the hard rock guys, So I question the sincerity of that, even though he said it all the time,
When David died, were you surprised?
No, because the last years he really destroyed himself with the drink and stuff like that, and it scared me. It scared me that every time if he was with me and he had an occasional drink, an occasional white wine, and he would say, I'm not supposed to drink at all. The doctors say I'm an alcoholic. I'm not supposed to drink at all. And he says, but I'm only having a little bit. And it scared me because if you've ever known anybody who's an alcoholic, the things he was saying were like classic tells of an alcoholic. These are things alcoholics always say, like, it's just one glass of white wine, so what's the difference so long as I don't drink too much? What do the doctors mean I can't drink anything? And the doctors knew you shouldn't be drinking any because you've got whatever it is, it's not going to limit it to that. And so when people said, some people said, oh, they're shocked he was drinking, we had no idea he was drinking, this is absolute nonsense. He would find ways, and they were classic alcoholic ways, like they'd have a thing, like an after party or whatever for him and the members of his band and stuff, and he'd make a point of saying at the start of it, no liquor for me, I don't drink. But he'd take a drink out of each of the band members' drinks. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And he could tell himself, I didn't drink. And then he would tell me these weird stories about, like, he says, it was so odd. My father would say, I've given up smoking, and he'd light a cigarette right in front of me. And I'd say, you're in denial. You're smoking right now. He says, oh, I've really quit. I've absolutely quit. And I'd say, David, how is that any different than you saying, I've quit drinking, but I'm just having a little white wine? And he made it sound like a little white wine, like that's so mild, how could that be anything? And that's like a classic alcoholic's rationalization, because the alcohol in white wine is no different than the alcohol in scotch or, you know what I mean, or gin or beer. It's alcohol, and if your body, if you've got a dependency on it, you can find a way to keep yourself on that, and eventually it catches up with you. And that's what scared me. And at the end, he had managed to push so many people away from him. And at the end, like his last concert tour in England, he was, missing sound checks and, things, teching
Right.
the show, like to work on the sound and the lights. He would miss that or be late for it. Little things that were showing that he was no longer a reliable professional, and that gets around in the industry, and people start to say, oh, he's got a substance abuse problem or something, and they don't have to publicize it, but then you're not getting the work, and you're getting a reputation as being unreliable. So there were signs well before the end that things were going bad, and at the end he pushed almost everybody away, or be estranged from his daughter for a long time. I mean, there were a lot of sadnesses there, a lot of sadness. He missed out on an awful lot. the things that he would tell me were happy experiences in his life. They were rarely, though, connected with performing. They would be things like, a road trip he took with his brothers, or he would remember running around the woods at Eagle Rock Reservation in West Orange, in the adjoining town, and playing with the Mr. Machine toy his grandfather got him when he was 9. Odd little things to remember. And I've interviewed many celebrities who genuinely radiated a kind of contentment. It wasn't a shtick. It was they got satisfaction out of the work they were doing. They had done stuff that they felt good about. And David, a lot of times, if he wanted to talk about something else, something that was good, it was liable to be not the career successes. It was very odd. He was really trying at the end. He was trying in his later years to be a good father to his son. And that became an important goal for him because his own father had been such a screw-up. And so he took a justifiable pride that, he coached his son's, Little League team, and that he was there for his son's ball games. And so there were those things. But it was a sad life in the end. It was sad that he goes down that the hole from all the drinking and the drugs and stuff. There's not much you can. And at the end, when they're trying to say, there were all these ghoulish newspaper reports saying, "Oh, he needs a liver transplant and needs this." Nobody was going to give him a transplant at that point because, the body had been so damaged by so much abuse. It doesn't make you a good candidate for transplants when all of your organs have been damaged by all the drinking and stuff. I was surprised at how shaken I was by his passing, and it bothered me for a long, long time because there was so much talent there and so much promise there. And I remember this. I mean, still, it's fun to watch the Partridge Family reruns, and I remember the fun of watching those shows when they were brand new. And I don't know. It's.
Well, it sounds like you liked him.
Yes, and I had compassion for him because it didn't turn out well in the end. And yet he had told me that. He had said, "I'm just going to screw up. I'm going to." He said, "That's something in me. It doesn't matter if I make the money. I'm going to screw up." And you sort of felt like I looked at it after he died, and I thought, what could friends have said? What could friends have done? But they had tried. I mean, he went to rehab a few times. It didn't help. He went to psychotherapy all his life. It didn't help. I don't know the answer on that. But I know he did not want his kids. He did not want Bo or Katie to go into show business as kids. He was very much like he really believed he'd been damaged by it. And everyone has to make their own choices and their own do what's fulfilling for them in life. But it was interesting. He was so sure that it had damaged him that he didn't want them doing that.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation here, I'll tell you.
I'm honored to be on your show, Ghosty, and I appreciate all the time you gave me and the good questions you asked, and that you've already talked to David, so that's like cool in itself.
Yeah, well, it's, he's an endlessly fascinating character, and I think that for someone like me, I mean, I can't speak for you, but for someone like me who grew up being a fan of his and seeing how his life turned out, you're always in the back of your mind, subconsciously, I'm trying to fix his story.
Right,
me
too.
Yeah, it's the darndest thing. There's nothing that can be done. But there's a lot of if only this.
Right.
What could we have said? What could have, what could have happened? But I mean, he was his own worst enemy, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Chip. This has just been great. And where can people go to catch up with you and what you're doing?
Oh, that's so kind. Well, and by the way, if they're interested in the book that David and I wrote, Come On, Get Happy, you can get a Kindle edition of that. You can look it up, go to Amazon or whatever, and look for Come On, Get Happy by David Cassidy and Chip Deffaa. And there's a Kindle edition, and I actually added a chapter after he died to sort of update it a little bit. that's something. But I'm always up to something. That's a whole show in itself because I've produced about 40 albums. I have written 20 plays. So there's always something cracking. I even put out my own album this year. But the next time I produce an album that I sing on, I'm going to put on one of David's songs just because, just out of a little remembrance of him. Not that I could do it the way he could do it, but I do it the way I would do it,
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.